Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Jenkins. I'm the account manager for Connecting Up in TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up is part of the Info Exchange Group, and Info Exchange is a not-for-profit social enterprise that has delivered technology for social justice for over 25 years. With over 100 staff across Australia and New Zealand, we tackle the biggest social challenges for the smart and creative use of technology. I would love to welcome you to the webinar Microsoft Azure for Not-for-Profits, which will be presented by Marcus and Fahim from Info Exchange. We'll start with just a little bit of housekeeping here. All the lines are going to be muted, so if you've got any technical issues, please just type it into the questions box on the webinar panel and I'll do my best to help you out. If you've got any questions during the session, just type it into the questions box and I'll relay those back to the team at Info Exchange, and we'll try and answer relevant questions during the webinar and any extra questions down there at the end. Do note that your comments and questions won't be appearing to the entire group, though they will just only appear to me. If you're on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, that can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. So if possible, just close down your other programs just to help you have the best experience you can today. Do note this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slides will be sent shortly after the webinar ends, probably likely early next week, it's looking like at this stage. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar. We'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes of your time to provide us with any feedback on how it goes today. That's it from me. So guys, over to you.
Thanks, Eric, and really excited to be here with everyone this morning, just talking a little bit more about Microsoft Azure, because for us, we're seeing more and more nonprofits leverage the credits that are available from Microsoft, and also to modernize their infrastructure and allow people to work remotely far more effectively. My name is Marcus Harvey. Sitting next to me here is Fahim, so I'll show you for a couple of seconds before we turn off the webinar, just turn off the video just to save our bandwidth, or your bandwidth I should say. And what we're keen to do is give you some really useful insights about how organizations are making the most of Azure. As Eric said, please type your questions into the chat window if you have any queries. We will try not to go too fast, so hopefully you won't miss anything. But if you do, the session's being recorded and will be available afterwards. All the pricing and specs that we are listing in this webinar, they change regularly. So Azure has a really useful price estimator tool. So we do recommend that if you are looking at it, first of all, sign up for the non-profit grant that I'll talk you through in a second. And then you can try things in your own time and without costing anything. And that at least can give you a good understanding of the fundamentals. In terms of the grant, Microsoft has been very generous in terms of allowing all registered charities in Australia to access the $3,500 US, which turns out to around about $5,000 Australian, or about 6, if my maths is correct, so 5.5 New Zealand dollars. And that will allow you to consume any amount of Azure servers or services up to that amount. You can register your non-profit status with Connecting Up in Australia or TechSoup New Zealand. That will then give you your TechSoup token. You then visit the website up on the screen, Eligibility Web Azure websites, and enter your token number. From there, if you haven't, you need to set up your 365 nonprofits trial and activate your Azure subscription before entering your token details. Microsoft then gives you that link to activate Azure, and you can sign in with your Office 365 tenant admin credentials and start leveraging Azure. If you're interested, if you like what you hear in the webinar today, we do recommend that you go through that process, because it does give you that subscription so you can start to run up services and servers and make sure that you understand how it works before deciding whether or not you actually want to leverage it for your production environment. And so it's really useful from that perspective. Doesn't cost you anything, just a few minutes of your time to go through that process. And that's why we have that first, because we want to to make sure that everyone is aware of how to do that. I'm going to let Fahim talk through all the different options around package software, infrastructure, platform, service, etc., and then run you through Azure and what we can do with it from a non-profit perspective. Fahim, would you mind talking through this in a bit more detail?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'll be talking about the technical aspects with the Microsoft Azure. So this one, before we start getting to Azure, is a bit of terminologies here, which I just want to make it clear a little bit. So how things work these days is they're a bit kind of categorized as your needs and demands. So if you see the first one, it says package software, which basically you manage everything from the infrastructure to the applications to the storage to the network. And then if you can see, the second one is infrastructure as a service. So what happens here is part of the services are managed by you, part are managed by the vendor. So managing infrastructure, you will probably managing your applications, your middleware, your OS, and the base of it, like your physical aspects of things, will be managed by the vendor. So let's say if we're talking about Azure, which is a cloud computing environment, they will manage the backend for you, and you will manage all your OS, your applications, and all the other aspects of it. If you do platform as a service, so more services are managed by the vendors, and you only manage applications and your data. If you talk about software as a service, pretty much everything is managed by the vendor. So all you do is do your base configuration of your application, like how you want to use it, how you want to set it up. So basically all the management aspects goes to the vendor. One of the examples would be something like Office 365 email services. So everything is managed by the vendor, and you only manage your mailboxes and your settings for your spam, or you've got any rules. So it's one of the good examples for software as a service. So what is Microsoft Azure? So it's basically a cloud computing solution. I would say cloud computing as a cloud environment. I think it's a better term. So it's really a vast environment and has a lot of different products and services it offers. So as we said, platform as a service. So you can see that there's a lot of different modules in it that you can use for your needs and demands. So you can use compute, which you can do your VM, which are your virtual machines. They are equivalent to your physical machines back in the days when the virtualizing was not quite used. There were more physical machines that were used. So in Azure platform, it's still based on the backbone is physical, but all the end users see is the virtual machines. It has different components like web and mobile. If you are a developer, you can use the developer services. There's integration services between different components. There's analytics services for something like big data, data processing or data analytics. And there are hybrid operations, which if you have like some services on your premises and would you like to get those services working with the Azure, so you can use those hybrid operations, and they work very well, and keeping the sync between your on-premises and the Microsoft Azure environment.
Hi, Fahim. Just a quick question, actually, we've got from someone in the audience. Would you mind actually just seeing if you could move a little bit closer to the microphone? We've just got a bit of feedback here that the audio is a little bit unclear at the moment.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Yes, I think that's much clearer. Guys, if there's any more issues, can you please just let us know in the questions box and we'll relay that again. Thank you. Thanks, Fahim.
All right. So the second part of it is infrastructure services. So we have the compute, storage, and networking. So they are kind of a different modules, like how Azure works is you have different modules and they all link together and work together. You can have your standard compute machines, and then you can connect it with different sort of storages platforms that it offers, and then can connect further with any of the network requirements you have. Network could be something based on your virtual switches, which are like your physical switches, but more, looked as, how should I say, probably virtualized as appliances. You got your load balancers. You can do all sort of DNS settings there. You can have set up VPS, but now Azure also offers express routes, so you can have your direct links to Azure if you have running your existing data centers, or if you have sites where you have still your physical resources, physical compute resources, or physical network equipment. You can use express route to directly go to the Azure environment. Saves you a lot of bandwidth, and it's also much faster because the latency is quite low. So for Azure infrastructure, they have about 24 regions and about 19 online, and still they are bringing more data centers up. So if you can go online on the Azure website, you will find what the new ones are planned and which new ones are going to be active soon. So what can I do with Microsoft Azure? So as we just discussed, that Azure provides you all these different resources and different components which work together. So you can use Azure for different needs and requirements. So if you're hosting your servers, for instance, you have domain controllers, you have RDP services, you can migrate them to Azure. You can create your own virtual machines in Azure and install those roles or configure those roles. Azure also provides backup storage for any of the resources that you create on Azure, or if you have on-premises storage, which you can also back up. If you have on-premises servers, that can also be backed up through Azure, but that requires bandwidth and I would say a decent WAN connection. It also provides business continuity and disaster recovery solutions. So something which is, I think the better term is site recovery. So if you have different sites running servers, you can actually sync them with Azure services and they will replicate for you. So if you have a disaster, you can fail over those services to run from Azure. That requires a bit of configuration, but it's a really good service they offer. They also provide database hosting. So if you don't want to use a VM with SQL running on it, Azure provides its own SQL services directly, more suited for developers as well. It also provides website hosting. So you can run web apps on it, like I believe something like WordPress. It supports quite a few programming languages. I think in the further slides we will see that. So Azure Information as a Service provides virtual machines. So it's a bit of detail about what kind of virtual machines and what kind of profiles they have for virtual machines. So when you look at the bottom, A, V, V2, which is A version 2, D, V2, D version 2, all the way to H, they're different server profiles. So you can scale from 1 core, 768 meg of RAM, cost about $22 a month. You can go all the way up to 32 cores, 446 gig of RAM, which can cost you about staggering $9,144 a month. There is no minimum commit. You can switch up or down as you need those VMs. If you create a VM, you realize, oh, it's not good enough, I need more grunt, I need more compute power, you can always change it on the fly, but it does require a reboot for the settings to take place. It supports both the OSs, Windows and Linux. There are new classes added, EV2, which run the Hyper-V roles on the host. You can, the availability sets are ensured to 99.9% uptime SLAs, and it works with different other disaster recovery settings as well, which actually spreads the load across the Azure data center. So in case if the data center goes down, that machine can be brought up on a different data center. Deploys within 45 minutes using the Azure portal. Supports PowerShell. It has its own ARM templates for more specific needs and requirements. They have a lot of dedicated templates. If you need something very specific, you can create your own templates as well. Price ranges are a little bit different. US West seem to be a bit cheaper than Australia, most expensive. Maybe Australia's newer data centers, so probably that's why. And also there's a difference in the currency as well. So I think this is also plays a role in that. So if you look at the data center US, you might find they might have different profiles available, or if it's in Australia, they might be different. So there's at times there are different profiles as well. So maybe, for instance, if you see at the bottom D or D version 2, that might not be available in Australia. So that can happen. So when you have to choose your data center, you have to be careful to make sure that all the VMs that you need are available in that specific data center. Prices have fallen down since 2015. And they continue to fall as they introduce new VMs, and the different VM profiles have different features that can help you save the cost as well. Like there are some of the profiles which features if you don't use those VMs, like if you don't utilize a CPU high enough, they might save as a credit, and then they can provide that credit when you need that high CPU usage. So each profile has its different purpose. Profiles are also based on your requirements. Some are more like focused towards compute, some are focused towards the storage, some are focused more towards the networking side. For instance, if you want to run a web server, they're more focused toward a web server. A bit about Azure Virtual Networking. So Azure VM runs on the standard IPv4 virtual networks with static and dynamic options. So you can set up static IPs, dynamic IPs. You can have Azure gateways, and there are quite few routers that are supported. So with the gateways, you can configure different aspects of VPNs and things like that. There's a link there which you can find a bit more about the VPN gateways, and probably will have a detail about which devices are supported by Azure. It supports most of the, I would say, the widely industry standard devices that are being used. So and it has a lot of information about the ciphers that it uses. So even if a device is not supported, but it uses those ciphers for the phase 1 and phase 2 of the VPN, the device could still be used. You can have network security groups. They are more like virtualized firewalls for the VMs. So you can assign it to the group of VMs or a single VM, depending on your need. You can also have load balancers if you're running the remote desktop services, web servers. If you want to load balance them, you can use that. Load balancers for that will provide you a good balancing. There are also different tiers in it, depending on the need. So cost based on SLA, throughput, and numbers of VPN tunnel required. So if you need more bandwidth, and if you need more IPsec tunnels, if you need more point-to-point connections, you can select the VPN gateways. Usually basic does most of the job, but if you have more requirements, for instance, the VPN gateway 1, the VPN gateway throughput is up to 500 megabits. And then if you go higher, the bandwidth provided is higher, but also comes at a higher cost as well. Azure storage, basis of Azure VMs, database, web apps, and backups, all of them basically use Azure-based storage. Azure has different tiers of storage. The standard ones are your standard and premium and SSD. I think you can also get a standard SSD now as well. It depends on your performance. So ideally, let's say if you have a standard domain controller, there is basically no need to provide it a SSD. You can run it on a standard HD. But if you have resources that require higher compute, you can provide them premium SSD. The cost of premium SSD is slightly higher than the standard SSDs or the standard hard drives. The default level of redundancy is LRS, which is your local redundant copy, which keeps the 3 copies in the same data center in case there's an equipment failure. You can go geo redundancy, which is available at added cost. It actually stores the copy of your data across the other regions globally. So in case, let's say if you have your data sitting in an Australian data center and the whole Australian Microsoft Azure services have been hit. So you can fail over your services because you already have copies of your data in another data center. For instance, US data center, you can bring your services up in no time. Access via storage keys with encryption is available. So let's say if you have third-party devices, some of the I think Nest devices like Synology supports Azure backups as well. So you can use those encryption options there, and they will encrypt it, and it can only be decrypted by that key. So it's quite secure, and it uses secure file copies. So obviously data while it's transmitting as well as encrypted. It can store directly files into containers using HTTPS or SMB3. It doesn't support yet NTFS permissions, but I think soon they will have the 80 permissions linked into them. It's currently in preview, so they might come in probably, let's say, maybe 3-4 months. So standard, each Azure comes with a 127 gig of OS disk with the option of adding 1 terabyte disk for extra storage. I think that option might be soon more expandable. They have also introduced recently a smaller size. You can have your VM OS disk a bit smaller as well, but 127 standard. And the benefit of that is if you have OS that you're maintaining, for instance, installing updates, they can take a lot of space. So having a 127 gig is quite good. So here's a case study, which we have 3 different sites here. So the bottom is Melbourne office and Sydney office. On the top, we have Azure Sydney Data Center. So each of these sites have their own Azure supported routers, which can be interconnected to form a WAN, wide area network. And they can also break out to use the public internet services such as Office 365. Now, Office 365 services and Azure services do talk to each other. They're kind of linked, but accessing them is slightly different. So Azure itself is more of a, as I said, infrastructure-based service where you have your compute resources. And Office 365 is more like a software as a service. The back end actually is a bit can talk to each other, but on this case study, you can see when we need to connect to the internet Office 365 services, we use the internet services. But when we connect to the Azure side of the things, we need to use our VPN gateways to access the data. To manage Azure, you can manage it through the web interface, through the portal, but to actually connect to the resources and use those servers, you need sort of a network interface, which that bridges gap through your Azure gateways, your site-to-site VPNs. So all the services on your sites will be able to communicate with the services up in Azure if your VPN and your firewalls are configured correctly. And you should be able to authenticate against, if you have a domain controller, you should be able to authenticate your computers from your Melbourne and Sydney site to your domain controllers. You should be able to access the files on the file server. You should be able to print. So under the file server, which you see says A2 VM, so that's the profile of the VM. So you can select any profile based on the load. So if you find out the file server is getting hit harder, you can always change the profile and just requires a reboot, and you should be able to get this change instantly. So you should also have to keep in mind that your links are have sufficient bandwidth, and the speed is also what is required, or else you will have a problem with congestion and stuff. So you will have a lot of packet drops and issues. So in order to plan your VPNs, you need to make sure that you have enough bandwidth and enough speed to support the request to Azure. Azure backup and recovery. So if you have the Azure VMs running, or the virtual machines running, you can directly use the Azure interface to back them up directly to Azure. You can set which region you want to back them up. Certain companies have a privacy policies that the data can't leave can't be stored on the offshore data center. So you can select the data center you want to store it into. With that is also the options of LRS and GRS. You want to have a local copy only, or you want to have a global copy stored as well. If you would like to You can also set up the retention, how long you want the backup to retain the copy. Let's say if I want to keep a specific backup for 3 months, but another specific backup for 6 months, up to a year. You can do that. You can set up multiple backups with multiple retentions based on the grandfather son rule, which is you can have a yearly, a monthly, a weekly, a daily. You can have multiple with different retention. So it can get quite technical with the backups as well, and should be able to satisfy the standard IT requirements for backups. If you have to back up your local servers, you at least need 2008 R2 or higher OS, and you should be able to install the Azure local agent on those machines, and then you should be able to back up into the Azure storage. System state backups are available through advanced settings, and also you can back up your file and other data as well. So the backup for, if you're backing up your local servers, it actually split into 2 sections. So you can set up your state system state backup and your files and other services backup. So Azure Site Recovery replicates your Hyper-V servers in Azure. I think you can use this service as kind of like a backup service, but with this one, the settings for retention are a little bit different than backup because this is more focused towards bringing the services back up instead of focusing on the long-term retention, which the backup does. So you can directly integrate it with your Hyper-V through the agent, and then those virtual machines running on your Hyper-V should be able to replicate in Azure. So in case if you have a disaster struck at your physical site, you should be able to easily get those Azure VMs, the ones that are replicating up there, should be able to bring them up in very little time with very little configuration. It does require a bit of work in advance to set up correctly. I mean, you can replicate without setting those things up, but if you have to fail over when a disaster happens, that will take you more time. It also provides you the functionality of testing it, so you can still run your VMs or your physical machines on your data center or your physical premises, and you can perform tests as well that would not impact any of your production environment. And that test can provide you with the feedback where the changes need to be made once a disaster struck, or does everything works once I bring those machines up in the test environment. So Azure does provide that, and once you finish your testing, you can do a cleanup, and everything will be cleaned up, and it will just go back to normal the way it was replicating. So it's a good feature to perform the test. Gives you a lot of insights about when a disaster would really strike. How do you fail over your services? So you only charged for the VM cost when you fail over. So the replication service doesn't have a sort of charge. It's only when you fail them over, when you start to use the compute resources, then they will actually charge you for those resources. So a bit about Azure SQL. PaaS as a replacement for SQL servers. You can run on-premises or Azure VM. So usually people use it SQL. They just install it onto their Windows boxes. It could be on premises, it could be on Azure, but then they have a PaaS service, which is platform as a service. So you actually use the instance of SQL Server through the Azure environment, and that is manageable through the Azure portal. So you don't need a VM or a physical machine to install the SQL. You can access the SQL services through the Azure portal. It starts about $7 a month for 2 gig of database size, and maximum you can go up to 4 terabytes, which can go up to 9,000 per month. And the SLAs are 99.9%. You can change the tiers without downtime. Application must support connecting to the Azure SQL. I mean, you got to check with your provider, the vendor of your software or services that you're using that require SQL services. Would it support? Because the connectivity is a bit different, because you might be using a public interface to connect through it, because it runs as a service which is not accessible internally. It comes through the the external interface. So you need to check with your vendor if this supports, and also you might require further configuration on your network equipment to access that service. Geo-replication automatic backups are also available for this service and is included in some plans already. You can, as I said, manage in the portal, and you can also able to manage through your SQL Management Studio. But then again, you just need to make sure that you have the connectivity to the portal or the interface where it needs to be managed from. So Azure has another service which is called the Azure AD Domain Services. AD is more like the Active Directory. So in the old days, Active Directory and the domain services were more available on your own servers. You have a server, you can install the Active Directory domain services, but Azure also provides this interface. It's also a PaaS service, this platform as a service. You don't necessarily have to have a VM and install that service on it. You can use the Azure portal interface to get it configured for you. So basically for that, Microsoft handles patching of the DCs and uptime. So when you talk about DCs here, what these DCs are, they are actually not, how should I say, they are not actually visible to you. They run on the back end. Microsoft manages it. You only get to see and work with the interface of the Active Directory and management of the users, groups, and other resources. All the back-end tasks, patching the server, managing the server, how much storage I need is all managed by Microsoft Azure. So it also uses the Azure AD username and password as an AD identity. So Azure has its own Active Directory system as well. So it kind of links with it. You can use that as well to have the consistency across. You can have the users, the passwords. You can have group changes through the same interface as Office 365 accounts. So as I previously mentioned in the slides, few slides earlier, that Microsoft Office 365 services and Azure services do talk at the back end. So if they are linked properly, you will see an account created on Azure services would be visible on Office 365 space as well. So you can manage then from a single interface. You can have multiple domains available in the same subscription, but you have to configure your network correctly to access them. You should be also able to join your other VMs that you have, or the virtual machines, desktops, or if you have laptops. But for that, if you're running them outside the Azure, like for instance, the VMs outside the Azure, of course you don't run desktops and laptops in Azure. So you need some sort of a connectivity to Azure Data Center, which is we saw previously in the case study that you need a VPN service. So you can have one router or firewall in your environment, which has the capability to initiate a VPN connection to Azure. And once that VPN connection is initiated, you should be able to join all your desktop, laptops, even some tablets these days support this feature, joining to AD. I think that might be possible to join them as well. It also integrates with the Azure AD multi-factor authentication. So that's a security feature Microsoft provides, which helps in accounts getting hacked and information getting lost. So they have different features with the AD authentication. You can have an SMS, or you can have an app with a code, or you can get a phone call to log into your service. So I think these days a lot of services are using multi-factor authentication. So it's about $1.78 per user per month, and that gives you a flexibility to get this another security layer to protect your account and data. So Azure AD services start about $142 a month, and it continues as you need. And when you don't need those services, you can, I think there's no commitment as well, and you can just close the services down. So hosting your public websites, you can host your websites as well, which you can also use platform as a service environment that they provide. So Azure Web App supports WordPress and other popular platforms, or you can create a blank web app or connect via FTP. They have support Visual Studio or GitHub. It also supports .NET, PHP, Node.js, Python, Java, and the other programming scripts. Deployment slots for seamless switching between devs and production, so you can have different environments which can seamlessly switch. So if you created a dev one, you say, okay, I want to change this dev to production one, you can switch that one. You can also configure backups, and automatically daily backups are configured on that as well. So bottom in the pictures, they have just a bit of preview that how those sort of profiles look. So even as you have profiles for server, here you can get different tiers of profiles, and it provides you with a different functionality depending on your needs and requirements. So implementation considerations, budget will be allocated, include time and dollars. I mean, if you just need to work out your requirements before you dig down into it, that matters a lot, because if you have miscalculated, that could impact later. Bandwidth is also very important. If you got, let's say, for instance, in ideal case, 100 gig of data, but you're copying a lot of files up and down, you might run out of that 100 gig very fast. So it's good to work out your bandwidth requirements. It's also good to focus on your outbound traffic and monitor it if it's increasing. A lot of network equipment can do that as well. They have this built-in functionality or third-party tools. Application license is transferable to run on cloud services. For instance, license mobility. Some of the application vendors might not support virtualizing of their equipment, so I mean of their softwares. So it's good to check with them if they will work in a virtual environment or cloud services. Supported routers, which are for site-to-site VPN. So if your router is not supported, that would not be able to initiate a VPN connection. So it's good to check that. So only to Windows Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 and higher can run as a Azure VM. So when you deploy, it will give you the list, and it starts from Windows 2008 R2. Test your deployments 2 weeks before you go live. You may need Microsoft support to deploy in certain locations. Also, there's Microsoft support available. They have different tiers for the support as well, depending on the requirement. You can consider if you need support and look into that as well. So there's some reasons which you might still need a server. You still have centralized workforce. You work with large files like high-res images or videos. With low bandwidth internet connections, you can't do a lot of transfers, too much latency in the network connection. If you prefer fixed or upfront cost, or even if it's higher, I mean, even Azure can give you a good estimate of the cost. So these days, you can work it out. Cost is maybe it's a factor, but I think more than cost, sometimes it becomes a matter of the infrastructure. You can also pursue hybrid approaches for complex server environments. So sometimes it's hard to get out of the hybrid environments. It depends how complex it's set up. So that could be a reason why people can't move their services to Azure. So what could US 3,500 get me in Azure? So that's the Microsoft grant that you can get from Azure as a non-for-profit. So this is just a simple case study. So we got here services type, description, purpose, and their estimates. So if you look at the service type, we get a virtual server, 2 of them. Profile is A2 version 2, 2 cores, starts with 4 gig of RAM and 135 gig of disk, which I think maybe you can get away with the standard 127 gig as well. So the 744 hours are the calculated time approximately for a month. This is how Azure calculates it in an hour, because the compute is based on minutes and hours. The charge is basically based on minutes and hours for the compute resources. So purpose, you're using those VMs for hosted domain controllers, file archives, print services, and AD Connect tools. That's for the syncing. The cost comes to about $300 a month. Then you have a VPN gateway for your on-premises devices to connect with those domain controller and file services. So you can get a standard tier gateway, 744 hours, about equivalent a month, and about 100 gig of outbound internet traffic from Azure to your premises, and manage secure data transfer between Azure and offices costs you about $190. You can use your storage, 600 gig of storage, local redundancy on it, about I think it's about 10,000 or 100,000 transactions in it. So the storage account, which is used for, is basically for your can be used for your backups and things like that. This is mostly used for your files and backups. So that comes about $60. So your monthly cost about $554, annual about 6,648. So you deduct from about the 5,000 Australian dollar credit, so you only end up paying about $1,000, 648. So it is another example. So this one is a small two-tier app into Azure. So if you want to move two tiers app in Azure, a small one. So in this one, one virtual machine with 1 core, 2 gig of RAM, 10 GB of disk. That runs for SQL VM for database, not compatible with Azure SQL. So that's why we're running the VM for SQL. It's not compatible with Azure. Storage, we're using a storage blob storage as the Azure type of storage. LRS again, local redundancy, and blob storage account here, that is. So 1 terabyte of SQL storage on VM template. So the VM cost us about $72 and storage cost us $26. And then AADDS, which is the Azure Domain Services. So Azure can manage those services for us. So we take the free tier of that per user MFA billing model. And you have about, that service gives you about 25,000 to 100,000 directory objects. You can have it. So that comes about $140. You got another virtual machine for your RDP VM, so people can jump onto that VM and access services into that environment. That's about $150. So here you get about a monthly cost of $391. So your annual comes to $4,700. It gets everything from your credit. You pay basically nothing from your pocket. So here's another one, move a two-tier app into Azure plus Azure SQL. So in this example, we're using the Azure SQL instance, not a SQL on a VM. So here we have a Azure SQL instance, a single database tier, up to 250 gig of storage. Description, yep, same Azure SQL with 250 gig, cost us about $21 a month. And then we have the Azure Domain Services, which costs us about $142. We got another virtual machine here, which we're using RDP, so we can jump onto it and access those services up in Azure. That costs us about $255. So monthly cost is $419. Annually comes up to $5,028. So you only pay $28 basically for that year, and I can use the two-tier apps with SQL, Azure SQL. So backup and replication. So you can get the cost there. I think it's about 0.03 per GB, but it also could depend how you're backing up. So if you're backing up just the Azure VMs, there's a more of a standard cost, but when you start to back up your file from your premises, that cost can change because Azure provides a bit of different models based on hot and cold storage. Now those storages are based on the requirements is how often you back up and how often you want to restore. So if you do less restores, cold storage will be better because you just want to store it for a longer time. But if you do more restores, a hot storage would be much cheaper because the restore read cost is cheaper. Site recovery to Azure, about $31.85 per month. And also the VM storage is about 10 cents per gig. They don't charge you for compute. You're only going to pay for compute once you start to fail over those services. So where to next? Research the parts of Azure that might be relevant to you. You can talk to your software vendors about supporting for hosting these applications in Azure, make sure all the license and services are transferable and there are no issues with the virtualizing of your applications. You can sign up for a free trial and visit the Azure Marketplace. You can see what kind of appliances they have. The list keeps growing. You can sign up for your non-profit Office 365 and Azure Grant. Usually it's a very fast process. They have just some questions that you gotta provide about your organization, and it's pretty much done. It gets done within a few days, and you should be able to straight away get into Azure and start using those resources. So there's the Azure website, is azure.microsoft.com. They have technical documentation. You can sign up your trial there. You can contact sales from there, and you can also find the calculator there as well, the price calculator. But the URL is there is azure.microsoft.com/engb/pricing.
Thanks, Fahim. So from my perspective, Azure is a fantastic mechanism for non-profits to start to move some of their servers and those payloads into the cloud. The easiest thing that we see organizations do is use it for backup. So use it, it's an easy cloud backup. The Azure backup as a service it works well. It's cost effective because you can pretty well almost always cover it within your grant unless you've got a mountain of servers and VMs that you've got to back up. The other two things that we see people use most often are either site recovery, so effectively that gives you a DR instance for anything that you run on premise that's automatically updated, or well, I should say, and running a secondary Active Directory server up in the cloud, so you've got some redundancy in the event of local site failure. So they're probably the top three things that we're seeing organizations do as a matter of course, which is fairly easy. Fahim has talked through a mountain of detail, because there is a lot of detail underneath Azure. What type of storage redundancy you want, network configuration, disk, etc., etc. But the key thing to remember is it is a fairly simple concept. You can put your server up in the cloud. You can access it once you've got your network configured correctly to give you that access. That can give you backup, that can give you resilience, that can give you disaster recovery. And so for us, what we're doing is we're seeing non-profits move more and more of their servers up into the cloud where they want that flexibility or where they want mobility to be able to access it from multiple sites. Or they want those higher availability or disaster recovery options, because often non-profits in our experience haven't really had good DR solutions in place for on-premise infrastructure. Eric, I'm going to hand back to you now, just in case there's any further questions, but hopefully that's given everyone some really good insights, some information, as well as some great resources for further research.
We haven't got any questions at the moment, Marcus and Fahim. What I might do is if you guys have any last words, I'll let you go through that. Then I'll do the outro, and we'll just give people a few more minutes here to think of any last minute questions if they've got any. And yeah, just give me a little bit of time.
Thanks, Eric. No, for us, the key thing is it's worth getting in and having a play. All right, so it's not hard to get that grant, to establish your Azure, particularly assuming you're on Office 365 already, or at least you've established your 365 tenant. You don't actually have to be using it. It's easy once you've got your tenant to get Azure as well. So that's comment one. Comment two is once you've got that, it's really easy to spin up a VM and have a play, right? And you can do that in an isolated test environment, disconnected from your production environment, and then you can get a bit of familiarity. It's then comparatively easy to get backup working if that was of interest to you. And that's a nice, easy, low-cost solution to give you a little bit of confidence, and so you can see how it works and configure Azure. From there, you can take it to additional areas. We've seen, as you saw within one of the case studies, organizations completely move to Azure and eliminate their local on-premise server infrastructure, and that's working very well for scores of non-profits that we work with, so it's well worth considering. So our big recommendation is, yes, there's a lot of technical detail. That's if you are technically minded and you manage your technical infrastructure on-prem. A lot of this stuff will not be overly unfamiliar, but if not, you can also get started reasonably quickly as well. Thanks, Eric.
That's all right. Thanks for that, Marcus. We actually had a couple of questions come through, so I might cover those now before closing out. So the first question we've got, and I think you just addressed this point a little bit, is what skill sets are required to manage your Azure?
I'll have a quick answer and then Fahim can add. The same skill sets as you would require to manage it on-prem, but there is an Azure nuance and flavor over the top of it. So the same as if you have to upskill from 2008 to 2016 server, there is an upskill requirement to get into the Azure space, but it's the same core. You need networking knowledge, you need server management knowledge, you need Microsoft Windows Server knowledge, plus an Azure flavor, which is a little bit over the top of that. Fahim, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think, Marcus, you explained it quite well. I would just say, probably in a bit of different wordings, is there's two aspects to management here: the Azure management and your services management. So, I mean, if you have worked in your existing data center or worked on your premises with equipment, you probably might be used to managing your servers, your operating systems. But here you have another layer on top, which you have to manage, the Azure layer. Now, the Azure layer management is not that hard, but it starts to get more complicated when you start to bring the services in. Then you got to keep an aspect of how Azure will communicate with your services. So if you've got a, let's say, domain controller, you need to make sure that you have configured the right network, the right VPN is in place, the right storage is assigned, or you'll be basically pulling your hair where the issue is and where I have to look into. So you need that aspects of technical knowledge, but also it adds a little bit of complexity. From my experience, when I jumped into Azure, as I was coming technically, I found it was not so difficult. If you have worked before, you have the technical knowledge, Azure wouldn't be that hard to pick up.
Thanks, Fahim.
Thank you, Fahim. Thank you, Marcus. The second question we've got here is, what would be the likely cost to transfer to Azure from Amazon Web Services?
It all depends on how much CPU, how many servers, what services, how much memory you use. So short answer is, it could cost you very little, it could cost you a lot, and it depends on what you're doing within AWS. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a how long's a piece of string answer. But if you're just using VMs, you can port the VMs across pretty easily, but you've obviously got to do your network configuration and setup. If you're using some of the snazzier Amazon feature sets, that then adds a little bit of complexity, and it's about transitioning those and transforming those into the Azure environment. Fahim, you've worked with both. What's your comment?
Yeah, so I think there is a transition cost as well involved, and that is, I think, that is the massive cost. I mean, if you plan it right, you can bring that cost down, but not planned properly, yeah, it's going to cause you a lot of massive cost. The benefit I see when I see Amazon services and Microsoft, if you're using the Microsoft house, it's better to use Azure in that sense, because you have all the services integrated. If you're using Office 365, makes more sense to use it. So I would just say, if you are planning, you have to plan it really well. You have to consider the cost. I mean, you can always get the trial, jump on Azure if you haven't done that. Just go have a look around. If you have worked in AWS, you'll find it is very similar. They are kind of like competitors. So they try to bring those features across. If Amazon has a new feature, Microsoft will bring it as well. So it's good to go play with it, see how you feel and it's compatible for you, and all the services will work. From my understanding, they should, but again, it's better to get that stuff done prior to going to that path.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Fahim, and thanks, Marcus. Thank you both for presenting today, and thank you, everyone, for coming along. Hope you learned a lot from this presentation and that we managed to get through all of your questions. If you've got any questions that come to mind later, just send that through to events@connectingup.org, and we'll try and get to those offline. Don't forget, there will be a recording for this up on the website again, probably early next week, so you'll be able to go through the recording again, go through the slides. Thank you so much for being with us, everyone. Have a great afternoon, have a great weekend, and we hope to catch you next time. Have a good one, guys. See ya.
See ya.